The dust cloud from the transport truck hadn't even settled when Sergeant Torres spotted him through the chain-link fence. An old man, maybe 65, walking slowly across the parking lot toward the Ranger training facility entrance. His weathered face was lined with deep creases, and his gray hair was cut military short but showed white at the temples. He carried a worn rifle case that looked like it had seen decades of use. Torres nudged his partner Martinez. "Check this out. Somebody's grandfather got lost." Martinez looked up from his equipment check and squinted at the approaching figure. The old man moved with deliberate steps, his back straight despite his age, but his pace was clearly that of someone whose best years were behind him. His olive-drab jacket hung loose on a frame that had once been broader, and his worn boots suggested he was probably a veteran trying to relive past glory. "Poor old-timer probably thinks this is some kind of reunion," Martinez said with a slight chuckle. "Should we tell him the VFW meeting is across town?" The morning sun was already heating up the Arizona desert around Fort Davidson, and the advanced marksmanship range stretched out beyond the facility buildings like a testament to military precision. This was where the Army's elite Rangers came to push their shooting skills to the absolute limit, where distances measured in thousands of meters separated the exceptional from the merely good. Staff Sergeant Blake Morrison emerged from the range office, clipboard in hand, ready to begin the day's training rotation. His eyes immediately found the old man approaching the gate, and his expression shifted to one of polite confusion. Morrison had been running precision shooting courses for 8 years, and he had never seen anyone this age attempt to sign up for advanced Ranger training. "Can I help you, sir?" Morrison called out as the old man reached the security checkpoint. The old man stopped and set down his rifle case with careful precision. When he spoke, his voice was steady but quiet, almost lost in the desert wind. "I'm here for the long-range competition." Morrison exchanged a quick glance with the guard at the checkpoint. The annual inter-unit marksmanship challenge was indeed scheduled for today, but the participants were supposed to be active duty Rangers, Special Forces, and other elite units. The competition featured some of the most difficult shots in military training, with targets placed at distances that challenged even the most experienced snipers. "Sir, I think there might be some confusion," Morrison said diplomatically. "This is a military training facility. The competition today is for active military personnel only." The old man reached into his jacket and produced a set of papers, his movements slow but purposeful. "My paperwork should be in order." Behind Morrison, several Rangers had gathered to watch the exchange. Corporal Davies, a 24-year-old marksman with multiple combat deployments, was shaking his head with amusement. Staff Sergeant Collins, whose own shooting record had earned him respect throughout the unit, was trying not to smile. $50 says security escorts him out in the next 5 minutes, Davies whispered to Collins. Collins looked at the old man's unsteady stance and the way he seemed to favor his left leg slightly. "I'm not taking that bet. Look at him. Guy probably hasn't held a rifle in 20 years. Morrison was examining the paperwork when Captain Rodriguez approached from the range control tower. Rodriguez had been expecting a full roster of the military's best shooters, men and women whose skills had been honed through years of intensive training and combat experience. Seeing this elderly civilian at his gate was not part of the plan. "What's the situation here, Morrison?" Rodriguez asked, his tone suggesting he wanted this resolved quickly. "Sir, this gentleman says he's here for the competition, but—" Morrison gestured vaguely at the old man, letting the obvious speak for itself. Rodriguez looked at the old man, taking in his age and apparent physical limitations. The competition would include shots at ranges up to 4,000 meters, requiring not just exceptional skill, but also physical stamina and mental focus that typically decline significantly with age. "What do you train for precision shooting in your area? Whether it's military ranges or civilian facilities, there's something special about watching true marksmanship unfold." "Sir, I appreciate your interest," Rodriguez said carefully, "but this competition is extremely demanding. The safety requirements alone." The old man's papers were apparently legitimate, because Morrison was nodding reluctantly as he reviewed them. But Rodriguez could see the doubt in his staff sergeant's eyes, the same doubt that was written across the faces of every ranger within earshot. "I understand your concerns, Captain," the old man said quietly, "but I believe you'll find everything is in order." Rodriguez looked at the gathering crowd of rangers, all of them clearly expecting the situation to resolve itself with the old man's departure. These were men who had earned their positions through extraordinary skill and dedication, and the idea that someone of this age could compete with them seemed almost insulting to their years of training. "Very well," Rodriguez said finally, "but I want it understood that this is a professional military competition. The distances involved are extreme, and the conditions are challenging even for our most experienced shooters." The old man simply nodded and picked up his rifle case. As he walked through the gate, Davies turned to Collins with a grin. "This is going to be entertaining," Davies said. "I give him one shot before he realizes he's in over his head." The equipment shed was filled with the finest precision rifles the military had to offer, but when the old man opened his worn case, several rangers couldn't help but stare. Inside was a rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than on a modern range. The wood stock was scratched and worn smooth by decades of handling, and the metal showed the kind of patina that only came from years of careful maintenance and heavy use. Specialist Harris, a 22-year-old sniper with 2 tours in Afghanistan, leaned over to get a better look. "Is that thing even zeroed?" he asked his teammate, Corporal Jensen. Jensen examined the old man's rifle from a distance and shrugged. "Probably hasn't been fired since Vietnam. Look at that scope mount. I've seen more modern equipment at gun shows." The old man seemed oblivious to their commentary as he methodically began assembling his shooting kit. His movements were slow but deliberate, each action performed with the kind of muscle memory that suggested decades of repetition. He pulled out a small notebook with yellowed pages and began making notations in handwriting that looked as weathered as the man himself. Morrison approached with the competition briefing materials, still uncertain about how to handle this unusual situation. "Sir, I need to go over the safety protocols and range procedures with you." The old man looked up from his notebook and nodded politely. "Of course, Sergeant." Morrison began his standard briefing, explaining the range layout and the progressive difficulty of the targets. The competition would start at 800 meters and work its way out to distances that pushed the limits of even military-grade equipment. Each shooter would have 3 attempts at each range, with scoring based on both accuracy and consistency. The final stage involved targets at 3,800 meters, Morrison explained, watching the old man's face for any sign of concern. "In 15 years of running this competition, we've only had 12 confirmed hits at that distance." The old man simply nodded and made another note in his book. Behind Morrison, Davies was explaining the situation to newly arrived rangers who had come to watch the day's events unfold. "Some oldemer showed up claiming he wants to compete," Davies said with obvious amusement. "Captain Rodriguez is actually letting him try. This should be good for a few laughs before the real competition starts." Staff Sergeant Collins was examining the roster of official competitors, all of whom represented the finest marksmen from various elite units. "Look at this lineup. We've got the top shooter from 3rd Battalion, the guy who won last year's Inter-Service Championship, and that SEAL who set the record at Quantico." The old man finished his equipment check and slowly made his way to the first firing position. The morning desert heat was already building, creating the kind of atmospheric conditions that could throw off even experienced shooters. Mirage effects would make distant targets dance and waver, requiring not just skill, but also the ability to read environmental conditions with precision. Captain Rodriguez observed from the control tower, still questioning his decision to allow this to proceed. Through his binoculars, he could see the old man settling into position with movements that suggested some familiarity with the process. But his age was clearly evident in the way he had to adjust his stance multiple times to find comfort. "Range is hot," Morrison announced over the public address system. "First shooter, first target at 800 meters." The regular competitors had gathered to watch, some with genuine curiosity, but most with barely concealed amusement. These were men who had spent years perfecting their craft, who had trained under the most demanding conditions the military could provide. The idea that someone of this age could compete with them seemed to violate everything they understood about the physical and mental demands of precision shooting. Corporal Thompson, whose own marksmanship scores had earned him assignment to a specialized sniper unit, was shaking his head as he watched the old man's preparation routine. I feel bad for the guy, honestly. He's probably remembering when he could actually see targets at these distances. The old man chambered his first round with deliberate care, the sound of the bolt action echoing across the range. He settled behind his rifle and began the process of acquiring his target, taking far longer than any of the regular competitors would need for such a relatively short distance. Morrison was tracking the old man's progress through a spotting scope, ready to offer guidance or call a halt if safety became an issue. The target at 800 meters was clearly visible through the morning air, a standard military silhouette that represented a routine shot for anyone qualified to be on this range. "Shooter ready?" Morrison called out. The old man raised his hand briefly, then returned to his rifle. The gathered rangers fell silent, some out of respect for range protocol, but others simply curious to see how badly this would go. Davies had his phone ready, planning to capture what he expected would be a memorable miss for later entertainment. The first shot came without warning, the sharp crack of the rifle splitting the desert silence. Morrison immediately focused his spotting scope on the target, searching for the impact point. For a moment, he said nothing, adjusting his scope and checking again. "Impact," Rodriguez called from the tower. Morrison was silent for several more seconds, double-checking his observation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of surprise that caused several rangers to look up from their own preparations. "Center mass," Morrison announced. "Good hit." The gathering of rangers exchanged glances, their easy confidence beginning to show the first small cracks. Davies lowered his phone, the amusing video he had planned to record suddenly seeming less entertaining. Jensen walked over to verify Morrison's call through a secondary spotting scope. After a moment of observation, he confirmed the hit with obvious reluctance. "Yes, center mass. Good shot." Collins looked at the old man, who was already preparing for his second attempt with the same methodical approach he had used for the first. "Lucky shot," Collins said quietly, but his voice lacked the certainty it had carried just minutes earlier. The old man fired his second round, and again Morrison called center mass. By the third shot, which also found its mark with precision that matched anything the regular competitors could achieve, the casual conversation among the rangers had stopped entirely. Captain Rodriguez lowered his binoculars and looked at the score sheet Morrison was preparing. 3 hits at 800 meters was exactly what he would expect from any qualified marksman. But somehow it looked different when achieved by someone who appeared to be well past his prime. "Next target, 1,000 meters, Morrison announced, his voice now carrying a more professional tone as he began to realize this might not be the brief diversion he had expected. The 1,000-meter target shimmered in the growing heat, a small dark shape that challenged even experienced eyes to maintain focus. The old man took considerably longer to settle into position for this distance, his movements showing the deliberate care of someone who understood that every small adjustment could mean the difference between success and failure at extended range. Davies had moved closer to the firing line, his earlier amusement replaced by genuine curiosity. "He got lucky at 800, he said to Harris, though his voice carried less conviction than before. This is where the real shooting starts. The atmospheric conditions were becoming more challenging as the desert's sun climbed higher. Mirage effects were starting to create visual distortions that could throw off elevation calculations, and a light crosswind had developed that would push projectiles off course if not properly compensated. These were the kinds of conditions that separated competent shooters from exceptional ones. Morrison watched through his spotting scope as the old man made minute adjustments to his scope settings. The process was taking much longer than it would for younger competitors, but there was something methodical about his approach that suggested familiarity with the challenges of long-range shooting. He consulted his worn notebook frequently, making calculations that appeared to account for the changing environmental factors. Captain Rodriguez had descended from the control tower to observe more closely. He positioned himself where he could see both the old man's shooting technique and the reactions of his rangers, who were finding it increasingly difficult to maintain their casual dismissal of this unexpected competitor. "Wind's picking up," Corporal Thompson observed, holding up a small wind indicator. 3 to 5 miles per hour from the northeast. That's going to complicate things at this distance. The old man seemed to be taking the wind into account, making additional scope adjustments and repositioning himself slightly to compensate for the changing conditions. His preparation routine was extensive, almost painfully slow by military standards, but it demonstrated an understanding of the variables that affected precision shooting at extended distances. Jensen was studying the old man's rifle through binoculars, trying to understand how such apparently outdated equipment could be producing consistent results. "That scope has to be at least 20 years old," he said to Collins. "I'm amazed it's even holding 0. Collins was beginning to show signs of genuine concern about what they were witnessing. The dismissive attitude that had characterized the Rangers' initial reaction was gradually being replaced by a more professional assessment of what they were seeing. "Maybe the old guy knows something we don't," he admitted reluctantly. The first shot at 1,000 meters took nearly 5 minutes to prepare, an eternity by competitive shooting standards. When the old man finally fired, Morrison immediately focused his spotting scope on the target, searching for the impact point among the heat distortions that made observation difficult at this distance. "I need a second confirmation," Morrison called out, unable to hide the uncertainty in his voice. Harris moved to the backup spotting scope and spent several moments scanning the target area. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of disbelief. "Center mass. Clean hit." The gathering of Rangers had grown as word spread through the facility that something unusual was happening on the precision range. What had started as casual entertainment was beginning to look like something more significant, though none of them were ready to admit that their initial assessment might have been wrong. The old man's second shot at 1,000 meters required another extended preparation period. He consulted his notebook extensively, made multiple scope adjustments, and even changed his shooting position slightly to account for the shifting wind conditions. The methodical approach was beginning to look less like the confused fumbling of an amateur and more like the careful preparation of someone who understood the complexity of what he was attempting. Staff Sergeant Blake Morrison had been running these competitions for years, and he had developed an eye for recognizing when shooters were out of their depth. What he was seeing from the old man didn't fit the pattern he expected. The extensive preparation time and careful attention to environmental factors suggested experience with challenging shooting conditions, even if the execution was slower than what he was accustomed to seeing from younger competitors. The second shot found its mark with the same precision as the first, drawing a grudging acknowledgement from the assembled Rangers that luck was becoming an increasingly unlikely explanation for what they were witnessing. Specialist Martinez, who had arrived from another training area after hearing about the unusual competition participant, positioned himself where he could observe the old man's shooting technique more closely. "His fundamentals are solid," Martinez admitted to his teammate. "Breathing, trigger control, follow-through. He's doing everything right, just taking forever to do it." The third shot at 1,000 meters completed another perfect sequence. 3 hits that matched the performance standards expected from elite military marksmen. The casual conversation that had characterized the early stages of the competition had given way to a more serious atmosphere as the Rangers began to realize that their assumptions about age and capability might need revision. Captain Rodriguez was reviewing the score sheet that Morrison was maintaining, noting that the old man's performance was tracking exactly with the scores achieved by much younger competitors. The time required for each shot was significantly longer, but the results were identical in terms of accuracy and precision. "Next target, 1,500 meters, Morrison announced, his voice now carrying the professional tone he used for serious competitors rather than the patronizing courtesy he had initially extended to the old man. The 1,500-meter target represented a significant step up in difficulty, a distance where environmental factors became critical and where even small errors in calculation or execution could result in complete misses. It was also the distance where many shooters began to reach the limits of their equipment and their ability to maintain the precision required for consistent hits. Thompson was explaining the increased challenge to newly arrived observers. 1,500 meters is where this gets interesting. The bullet drop is significant, the wind effects are magnified, and target acquisition becomes a real problem. Most shooters start showing their limitations at this range. The old man was taking even longer to prepare for the increased distance, consulting his notebook extensively and making careful observations of the environmental conditions that would affect his shots. His deliberate approach was beginning to look less like incompetence and more like the careful methodology of someone who understood exactly what he was facing. Davies watched the preparation process with growing unease. What had started as an amusing diversion was beginning to challenge everything he thought he knew about the relationship between age and shooting capability. The 1,500-meter target was barely visible through the heat distortion that now rippled across the desert range like water. What had been manageable atmospheric conditions at shorter distances now became serious obstacles that could turn a perfect shot into a complete miss. The old man spent nearly 10 minutes preparing for his first attempt, a duration that would normally draw impatient comments from watching rangers. But the comments weren't coming anymore. Instead, Corporal Jensen found himself studying the old man's technique with genuine interest, trying to understand how someone using apparently outdated equipment was maintaining the same performance standards as shooters half his age using the latest military hardware. "Look at how he's reading the wind," Jensen said quietly to Thompson. "He's not just checking the flags. He's watching the grass movement, the dust patterns, even the way the heat distortion shifts." Thompson nodded reluctantly. The old man was demonstrating an understanding of environmental factors that came only from extensive experience with challenging shooting conditions. His notebook contained what appeared to be detailed calculations for bullet drop, wind drift, and atmospheric pressure effects that matched the sophisticated ballistic computers used by modern military snipers. Morrison had positioned himself where he could observe both the old man's shooting process and the target area through his spotting scope. The distance was great enough that spotting hits required immediate attention and careful observation, especially with the visual distortions created by the desert heat. Captain Rodriguez was reviewing the competition roster, noting that several of the military's most accomplished marksmen were scheduled to shoot later in the day. These were Rangers and Special Forces operators whose shooting abilities had been proven in combat situations, men whose scores at these distances were consistently exceptional. The fact that an elderly civilian was matching their performance was beginning to require explanations that Rodriguez wasn't prepared to offer. The old man's first shot at 1,500 meters required a preparation time that tested the patience of everyone watching. He made multiple scope adjustments, consulted his notebook repeatedly, and even repositioned his rifle slightly to account for subtle changes in wind direction. When he finally fired, the delay between the shot and the sound reaching the target area was noticeable enough that several Rangers commented on the distance involved. Morrison searched the target area through his spotting scope, taking longer than usual to locate the impact point among the visual distortions. "Center mass," he announced, his voice carrying a tone of professional respect that hadn't been present earlier in the day. Harris confirmed the hit through the backup spotting scope, shaking his head slightly as he did so. "That's 3 different distances, 9 shots, 9 hits. All center mass." The gathering of observers had grown to include Rangers from other training areas who had heard about the unusual competition participant. What they found was not the amusing spectacle they had expected, but a demonstration of shooting capability that challenged their assumptions about age and performance. Specialist Rodriguez, who had arrived from the advanced marksmanship course, positioned himself where he could observe the old man's shooting stance and technique. "His body position is textbook," Rodriguez admitted to his teammate. "Bone support, natural point of aim, proper scope alignment. He's doing everything exactly right." The old man's second shot at 1,500 meters followed the same pattern of extensive preparation and precise execution. The time required was still significantly longer than younger shooters would need, but the results were identical in terms of accuracy. Morrison called another center mass hit, adding to a score sheet that was beginning to look remarkably consistent. Davies was explaining the situation to a newly arrived group of rangers who had come to see what was happening on the precision range. Some old guy showed up this morning, and he's been hitting everything they put in front of him. Perfect scores at 800, 1,000, and now 1,500 meters. The explanation was met with skepticism from the new arrivals, who looked at the old man's age and equipment with the same doubt that had characterized the initial reaction from the morning's observers. But as they watched him prepare for his third shot, the skepticism began to give way to curiosity about what they were witnessing. Staff Sergeant Collins was reviewing the day's schedule, noting that the competition was supposed to progress to much longer distances where the real challenges would begin. The 2,000-meter target is where most shooters start having problems, he said to Morrison. That's where we'll see what this guy is really made of. The old man's third shot at 1,500 meters completed another perfect sequence, maintaining the consistency that was becoming his trademark. Morrison confirmed the hit and updated the score sheet, which now showed performance that matched the standards expected from elite military marksmen. Captain Rodriguez was beginning to realize that his initial decision to allow this participation might have consequences he hadn't anticipated. The Rangers under his command were elite soldiers whose confidence in their abilities was built on years of training and proven performance. Watching someone they had initially dismissed demonstrate equivalent capability was having an effect on unit morale that he hadn't considered. The announcement for the 2,000-meter target brought a noticeable change in atmosphere among the watching Rangers. This was the distance where shooting became genuinely difficult, where environmental factors could overwhelm even excellent technique, and where equipment limitations often became apparent. Thompson was explaining the increased challenges to the gathered observers. 2,000 meters is where the real shooting starts. Bullet drop becomes extreme, wind effects are magnified significantly, and target acquisition requires exceptional optical equipment. The old man was already beginning his preparation routine for the longer distance, consulting his notebook extensively and making careful observations of the changing environmental conditions. The wind had shifted slightly, and the heat distortion was becoming more pronounced as the desert sun reached its peak intensity. Morrison was setting up additional spotting equipment for the longer distance, knowing that confirming hits at 2,000 meters would require multiple observers and careful coordination. The margin for error was small enough that even experienced spotters could miss impacts if they weren't positioned correctly. Jensen was studying the old man's rifle through binoculars, trying to understand how equipment that appeared to be decades old could be producing results that matched modern military hardware. That scope shouldn't be capable of the precision we're seeing, he said to Collins. The resolution at this distance should be marginal at best. Collins was beginning to admit that their initial assessment might have been wrong. Maybe we don't know as much about this as we thought we did, he said quietly. Maybe experience counts for more than we realized. The old man finished his preparation routine and settled into position for his first attempt at 2,000 meters, a distance that would test every aspect of his shooting ability and begin to reveal whether his earlier success was sustainable under truly challenging conditions. The 2,000-meter target was a mere speck against the desert backdrop, requiring optical magnification just to confirm its presence. At this distance, the curvature of the Earth became a factor in trajectory calculations, and the time of flight was long enough that changing wind conditions could affect a bullet's path significantly during its journey to the target. The old man's preparation time had increased proportionally with the distance, and he was now spending nearly 15 minutes calculating and adjusting for the complex variables that affected long-range precision shooting. His notebook was filled with calculations that appeared to account for everything from barometric pressure to the Coriolis effect, mathematical considerations that most shooters relied on computer systems to handle. Corporal Thompson was explaining the increased difficulty to a group of Rangers who had gathered to watch what was becoming an increasingly serious demonstration of marksmanship capability. At 2,000 meters, we're talking about a bullet drop of over 60 feet. The projectile is in the air for nearly 3 seconds, and any wind change during that time can push it completely off target. Morrison had enlisted additional spotters to help confirm hits at the extended distance, knowing that visual confirmation would be challenging even with high-quality optical equipment. The heat distortion was severe enough that targets seemed to dance and waver, making precise observation difficult for even experienced range personnel. Captain Rodriguez was monitoring radio communications from other training areas, where word of the unusual competition had spread throughout the facility. Several senior officers had expressed interest in observing the proceedings, and Rodriguez was beginning to realize that this informal demonstration might attract more attention than he had anticipated. The old man's first shot at 2,000 meters followed his established pattern of methodical preparation and careful execution. The sound of the rifle was followed by an extended silence as spotters searched the target area for impact signs. The distance was great enough that visual confirmation required careful coordination between multiple observers. "I need verification on that impact," Morrison called out after several minutes of searching through his spotting scope. Specialist Harris was scanning the target area with high-power optics, taking his time to ensure accurate observation. "I'm seeing what looks like a hit, but I need better atmospheric conditions to confirm placement." The heat distortion was making precise spotting extremely difficult, forcing the range personnel to wait for brief moments when the visual disturbance cleared enough to allow accurate observation. After several minutes of careful examination, Harris was able to confirm the impact. "Center mass confirmed," Harris announced, his voice carrying a note of respect that hadn't been present earlier in the day. The watching Rangers exchanged glances that reflected their growing realization that what they were witnessing wasn't luck or coincidence. Davies, who had started the day expecting entertainment at the old man's expense, was now watching with genuine fascination as assumptions about age and capability were systematically dismantled. Jensen was studying the ballistic requirements for consistent hits at 2,000 meters, calculating the precision required for the performance they were observing. "The margin for error at this distance is measured in inches," he said to Collins. "Wind reading has to be perfect, trajectory calculations have to be exact, and trigger control has to be flawless." The old man's second shot required another extended preparation period, during which he made multiple scope adjustments and consulted his notebook extensively. The environmental conditions were changing subtly but constantly, requiring continuous compensation for factors that could affect projectile flight over the extended distance. Morrison was coordinating with his spotters to ensure accurate observation of the second shot, knowing that the credibility of the competition depended on reliable confirmation of hits and misses. The distance involved made spotting challenging even under ideal conditions, and the desert heat was creating visual distortions that complicated the process significantly. The second shot produced another center mass hit, confirmed by multiple spotters after careful observation through the heat distortion. The consistency of the old man's performance was becoming undeniable, forcing the watching Rangers to confront the possibility that their initial assessment had been completely wrong. Staff Sergeant Collins was reviewing the score sheet that Morrison was maintaining, noting that 12 consecutive hits represented performance that exceeded the capabilities of many younger shooters using more modern equipment. "This isn't happening by accident," Collins admitted to Thompson. "This guy knows exactly what he's doing." The old man's third shot at 2,000 meters completed another perfect sequence, maintaining the consistency that had characterized his performance throughout the morning. Morrison confirmed the hit and updated the score sheet, which now showed results that demanded serious consideration from military personnel whose own expertise was being challenged. Captain Rodriguez was receiving radio calls from other units requesting permission to observe the competition, word having spread that something extraordinary was taking place on the precision range. The informal demonstration was attracting attention from throughout the facility, creating a situation that Rodriguez hadn't anticipated when he had agreed to allow the old man's participation. The announcement for the next target distance brought a noticeable tension among the watching Rangers. 2,500 meters represented a significant step beyond anything most of them had attempted, a distance where even elite military marksmen began to reach the limits of their equipment and training. Thompson was explaining the escalating challenges to the growing crowd of observers. 2,500 meters is where shooting becomes as much about reading environmental conditions as it is about marksmanship fundamentals. The slightest miscalculation in wind speed or direction can result in a complete miss. Morrison was setting up additional spotting equipment for the longer distance, coordinating with range personnel to ensure that hits could be confirmed reliably despite the visual challenges created by distance and atmospheric conditions. The margin for spotting error was becoming smaller as the distances increased. The old man was beginning his preparation routine for 2,500 meters, a process that was taking even longer as the complexity of the calculations increased. His notebook contained pages of data that appeared to account for every variable that could affect long-range shooting accuracy, mathematical considerations that demonstrated an understanding of ballistics that most shooters acquired only through extensive experience. Davies was watching the preparation process with growing amazement. He's been at this for hours, and he hasn't missed a single shot. That's not luck. That's not even just skill. That's something else entirely. Harris was studying the old man's shooting technique through binoculars, trying to understand how someone using apparently outdated equipment was achieving results that matched the best performance standards of modern military marksmen. His fundamentals are perfect, Harris said to his teammate. Breathing, trigger control, follow-through, everything is textbook perfect. The old man settled into position for his first attempt at 2,500 meters, a distance that would test every aspect of his shooting ability and begin to reveal whether his remarkable consistency could be maintained under the most challenging conditions the range could provide. The 2,500-meter target was barely distinguishable from the surrounding landscape, a challenge that pushed the limits of both human vision and mechanical precision. At this distance, atmospheric conditions became critical factors that could determine success or failure regardless of shooting skill, and the time required for projectile flight was long enough that environmental changes during the bullet's journey could affect impact significantly. Morrison was coordinating with multiple spotters positioned at different angles to ensure reliable observation of impacts at the extended distance. The heat distortion was severe enough that confirmation of hits required careful collaboration between experienced observers, and even then, precise placement determination was challenging. The old man's preparation time had increased to nearly 20 minutes, a duration that reflected the complexity of calculations required for consistent accuracy at extreme range. His notebook was filled with environmental data collected throughout the morning, wind speed measurements, temperature readings, and barometric pressure observations that formed the foundation for his ballistic calculations. Specialist Martinez had arrived from the advanced sniper course, drawn by reports of the unusual competition participant. He positioned himself where he could observe the old man's technique and equipment, trying to understand how apparently outdated gear was producing results that matched modern military standards. That rifle has to be at least 30 years old, Martinez said to Jensen. The scope looks like something from the 1980s. I don't understand how he's maintaining precision at these distances with equipment like that. Jensen was beginning to develop a theory about what they were witnessing. Maybe it's not about the equipment. Maybe it's about understanding how to use whatever you have. Look at how much time he spends on environmental assessment. He's accounting for variables that most of us rely on computers to calculate. Captain Rodriguez was fielding radio calls from senior officers who had heard about the demonstration and wanted to observe the proceedings personally. What had started as a routine training day was attracting attention from throughout the military hierarchy, creating pressure that Rodriguez hadn't anticipated. The old man's first shot at 2,500 meters followed his established pattern of extensive preparation and methodical execution. The projectile flight time was long enough that several rangers commented on the delay between the rifle report and the target impact, a reminder of the extreme distance involved in the shot. Morrison and his spotters spent several minutes searching for the impact point, using high magnification optics to scan the target area despite the visual distortions created by distance and atmospheric conditions. The confirmation process required careful coordination and multiple observations to ensure accuracy. Impact confirmed, center mass. Morrison announced after extensive verification, his voice carrying the professional respect that the old man's performance had earned throughout the morning. The watching Rangers had grown silent as the implications of what they were witnessing became clear. 15 consecutive hits at progressively challenging distances represented performance that exceeded the capabilities of most military marksmen, regardless of age or equipment quality. Staff Sergeant Collins was reviewing competition records from previous years, comparing the old man's performance to the best scores achieved by elite military units. "This is unprecedented," Collins said to Thompson. "I've never seen consistency like this at extreme range. Most shooters are lucky to achieve 50% hits at these distances." The old man's second shot at 2,500 meters required another extended preparation period, during which environmental conditions continued to change subtly. Wind speed and direction were shifting slightly. Temperature was rising, and atmospheric pressure was fluctuating enough to affect trajectory calculations for projectiles traveling such extreme distances. Harris was explaining the escalating difficulty to newly arrived observers who were struggling to understand the significance of what they were seeing. At 2,500 meters, we're talking about projectile flight times of over 3 seconds. Any change in wind conditions during that time can push a bullet several feet off target. The second shot produced another confirmed hit, adding to a score sheet that was beginning to look like a textbook demonstration of precision shooting rather than a competitive evaluation. Morrison updated his records while coordinating with range personnel to prepare for even longer distances that would test the absolute limits of shooting capability. Corporal Davies was struggling to reconcile what he was observing with his initial expectations. "I thought this would be over in 10 minutes with some old guy embarrassing himself. Instead, we're watching someone demonstrate shooting skills that most of us can only hope to achieve." The old man's third shot at 2,500 meters completed another perfect sequence, maintaining consistency that was becoming his defining characteristic. The hit was confirmed by multiple spotters, and Morrison added it to a score sheet that now showed 18 consecutive hits at distances ranging from 800 to 2,500 meters. Captain Rodriguez was reviewing the competition schedule, noting that the remaining distances would push in a territory where even the most accomplished military marksmen began to experience significant difficulty. 3,000 meters represented a barrier that few shooters could cross consistently, and beyond that late distances that challenged the fundamental limits of rifle accuracy. The announcement for the 3,000-meter target brought a noticeable change in atmosphere among the assembled Rangers. This was a distance that separated exceptional shooters from merely competent ones, where environmental factors became so critical that success required not just skill, but also favorable conditions and considerable luck. Thompson was explaining the increased challenges to the growing crowd of observers. 3,000 meters is where physics starts working against you. Bullet drop becomes extreme, wind effects are magnified exponentially, and target acquisition requires exceptional optical equipment and perfect atmospheric conditions. Morrison was coordinating the setup of additional spotting equipment for the longer distance, working with range personnel to position observers at optimal angles for confirming hits at extreme range. The visual challenges created by distance and atmospheric distortion would make accurate spotting extremely difficult even under ideal conditions. The old man was beginning his preparation routine for 3,000 meters, a process that was taking even longer as the environmental calculations became increasingly complex. His notebook contained detailed atmospheric data collected throughout the morning, wind measurements taken at multiple times and locations, and ballistic calculations that accounted for every variable that could affect projectile flight over such extreme distances. Jensen was studying the ballistic requirements for consistent hits at 3,000 meters, calculating the precision demanded for the performance they were expecting to witness. At this distance, the margin for error is measured in fractions of inches for scope adjustment and fractions of miles per hour for wind reading. Everything has to be perfect. The old man settled into position for what many observers expected would be his first miss of the day, a distance that would finally reveal the limits of his remarkable shooting ability and restore the natural order that his earlier performance had disrupted. The 3,000-meter target existed at the very edge of what could be considered practical rifle range, a distance where atmospheric conditions and equipment limitations began to override even exceptional shooting skill. The target was so far away that confirmation of its presence required high-magnification optics, and spotting hits would challenge even the most experienced range personnel. Major Williams had arrived from the base command center, drawn by reports that were circulating throughout the facility about the unusual demonstration taking place on the precision range. He positioned himself next to Captain Rodriguez, both officers struggling to understand the implications of what their personnel were describing. 18 consecutive hits, Williams asked quietly, reviewing the score sheet that Morrison had been maintaining. At distances up to 2,500 meters, using what appears to be civilian equipment from the 1980s. Rodriguez nodded, his own disbelief evident despite having witnessed the performance personally. "I've been watching since this morning, sir. Every shot has been center mass. His preparation time is extensive, but his execution has been flawless." The old man was deep into his preparation routine for the 3,000-meter attempt, a process that now required nearly 30 minutes of calculations and adjustments. His notebook had become a comprehensive reference document filled with environmental data, wind measurements, and ballistic calculations that demonstrated an understanding of long-range shooting that exceeded what most military personnel achieved, even with computer assistance. Staff Sergeant Collins was explaining the escalating difficulty to Major Williams, hoping to convey the significance of what they were witnessing. "At 3,000 meters, sir, we're beyond the effective range of most military rifle systems. The projectile drop is over 100 feet, flight time exceeds 4 seconds, and wind effects can push bullets several yards off target." The assembled Rangers had grown to include personnel from throughout the facility, word having spread that something extraordinary was taking place on the precision range. What had begun as casual entertainment had evolved into a demonstration that was challenging fundamental assumptions about the relationship between age, equipment, and shooting capability. Morrison was coordinating with multiple spotters positioned at different locations around the range, knowing that confirming hits at 3,000 meters would require exceptional cooperation and careful observation. The visual challenges created by distance and atmospheric distortion would make accurate spotting extremely difficult even under optimal conditions. Specialist Harris was studying the environmental conditions that would affect the 3,000-meter shot, noting factors that made success increasingly unlikely. Wind is gusting between 5 and 8 miles per hour from the northeast. Temperature differential between firing point and target area is creating significant mirage effects. Atmospheric pressure has been dropping steadily since morning. The old man seemed to be accounting for all of these variables in his preparation, making continuous observations of wind indicators positioned at various points along the range, and consulting atmospheric data that he had been collecting throughout the day. His methodical approach suggested an understanding of environmental factors that came only from extensive experience with challenging shooting conditions. Jensen was explaining the ballistic challenges to newly arrived observers who were struggling to comprehend the difficulty of what they were witnessing. At 3,000 meters, an onomatopoeic error in wind reading can cause a miss of several feet. A single degree of temperature difference can affect bullet trajectory significantly. Everything has to be calculated perfectly and executed flawlessly. The old man's first shot at 3,000 meters followed his established pattern of extensive preparation and careful execution, but the distance involved meant that even confirming whether he had fired required attention to the delayed sound reaching the target area. The projectile flight time was long enough that several Rangers counted the seconds between rifle report and impact. Morrison and his team of spotters spent nearly 10 minutes searching for impact signs, using high-magnification optics to scan the target area despite visual distortions that made observation extremely challenging. The confirmation process required multiple observations and careful verification to ensure accuracy. I'm seeing what might be an impact, but I need better atmospheric conditions to confirm placement, Harris called out, struggling with the visual distortions created by distance and heat. The spotting team waited for a brief clearing in the atmospheric disturbance, using the momentary improvement in visibility to locate and confirm the impact point. When the confirmation finally came, it was delivered with obvious reluctance from personnel who were struggling to accept what they were observing. Center Mass confirmed. Morrison announced, his voice carrying disbelief despite the professionalism he was trying to maintain. Major Williams looked at the score sheet and then at the old man, who was already beginning preparation for his second attempt. 19 consecutive hits, Williams said quietly to Rodriguez, at distances that challenge our best-equipped sniper teams. This is impossible. The old man's second shot at 3,000 meters required another extensive preparation period, during which environmental conditions continued to change in ways that complicated an already difficult shot. Wind patterns were shifting, temperature was rising, and atmospheric pressure continued to fluctuate enough to affect trajectory calculations significantly. Collins was reviewing military shooting records, trying to find any precedent for the consistency they were witnessing. I've never seen anything like this, sir. Most elite marksmen consider themselves successful if they achieve 60% hits at these distances under ideal conditions. The second shot produced another confirmed hit, adding to a score sheet that was beginning to defy military understanding of what was possible with rifle marksmanship. Morrison updated his records while coordinating with range personnel to prepare for distances that would push into territory rarely attempted even during advanced training. Corporal Thompson was struggling to maintain his professional composure as assumptions about shooting capability were systematically dismantled. This guy is rewriting what we thought we knew about long-range marksmanship. Equipment age doesn't seem to matter. Physical limitations don't seem to matter. Experience is apparently everything. The old man's third shot at 3,000 meters completed another perfect sequence, maintaining consistency that was becoming impossible to explain through conventional understanding of shooting skill and equipment capabilities. The hit was confirmed by multiple spotters, and Morrison added it to a score sheet that now showed 21 consecutive hits. Captain Rodriguez was fielding radio calls from senior command personnel who were requesting detailed reports on what was taking place at the precision range. The informal demonstration had attracted attention from the highest levels of military leadership, creating scrutiny that extended far beyond the training facility. The announcement for the 3,500-meter target brought complete silence among the assembled Rangers. This was a distance that existed at the absolute edge of rifle capability, where success required not just exceptional skill, but also perfect conditions and considerable fortune. Major Williams was reviewing the competition parameters, noting that they were approaching distances that few military personnel had ever attempted under any circumstances. 3,500 meters is beyond the scope of normal training, Williams said to Rodriguez. We're entering territory that challenges the fundamental limits of what's possible with small arms. The old man was beginning his preparation routine for 3,500 meters, a distance that would test every aspect of his shooting ability and either confirm his remarkable consistency or finally reveal the limits that everyone expected to find. The 3,500-meter target represented a distance that challenged the fundamental physics of rifle marksmanship, where bullet drop exceeded 150 feet and projectile flight time stretched beyond 5 seconds. At this range, atmospheric conditions became more critical than shooting technique, and equipment limitations often determined success regardless of operator skill. Colonel Harrison had arrived from division headquarters, accompanied by senior staff officers who had been monitoring radio reports of the extraordinary demonstration. The gathering now included some of the highest-ranking personnel on the base, all struggling to understand how an elderly civilian was achieving performance that exceeded established military standards. 21 consecutive hits, Colonel Harrison said quietly, reviewing the detailed score sheet that Morrison had been maintaining, at distances that challenge our most advanced sniper systems. Captain Rodriguez, I need to understand exactly what we're witnessing here. Rodriguez was struggling to provide explanations that made sense within conventional military understanding of marksmanship capability. "Sir, I've been observing since this morning. His preparation time is extensive, but his execution has been flawless. He's using what appears to be civilian equipment from several decades ago." The old man was deep into his preparation routine for the 3,500-meter attempt, a process that now required over 40 minutes of calculations and environmental assessment. His notebook had become a comprehensive ballistic reference filled with data that accounted for variables most shooters never considered, mathematical calculations that demonstrated mastery of long-range shooting principles. Morrison was coordinating with an expanded team of spotters positioned at multiple locations, knowing that confirming hits at 3,500 meters would require exceptional cooperation and advanced optical equipment. The visual challenges created by extreme distance made accurate observation nearly impossible even under optimal atmospheric conditions. Major Williams was explaining the escalating difficulty to Colonel Harrison, hoping to convey the unprecedented nature of what they were observing. "At 3,500 meters, sir, we're beyond the effective envelope of standard military rifles. Projectile energy is minimal, environmental effects are extreme, and target acquisition requires perfect atmospheric conditions." The assembled personnel now included representatives from multiple military specialties, all drawn by reports of performance that seemed to violate established understanding of shooting capability. Sniper instructors, ballistic specialists, and range safety officers were all struggling to explain what they were witnessing. Specialist Martinez was studying the environmental factors that would affect the 3,500-meter shot, noting conditions that made success statistically improbable. Wind variance between firing point and target area is significant. Temperature differential is creating massive mirage effects. Atmospheric pressure has been unstable throughout the afternoon. The old man appeared to be accounting for all environmental variables in his preparation, making continuous observations of atmospheric conditions and consulting meteorological data that he had been collecting since early morning. His approach suggested understanding of factors that most military personnel relied on sophisticated computer systems to calculate. Staff Sergeant Collins was reviewing technical specifications for the equipment being used, trying to understand how apparently outdated gear was producing results that challenged modern military hardware. That rifle system shouldn't be capable of the precision we're seeing. The optics are decades old, the ammunition appears to be standard commercial grade, and the mechanical tolerances can't match current military specifications. The old man's first shot at 3,500 meters followed his established pattern of meticulous preparation and deliberate execution, but the extreme distance meant that confirming the shot required careful attention to projectile flight characteristics. The sound delay between rifle report and target impact was noticeable enough that several observers commented on the distance involved. Morrison and his expanded spotting team spent nearly 15 minutes searching for impact signs, using the most powerful optical equipment available to scan the target area despite visual distortions that made observation extremely challenging. The confirmation process required multiple independent observations and careful verification procedures. Impact location uncertain due to atmospheric conditions, Harris reported after extensive searching. "I need additional time for confirmation." The spotting team waited for optimal atmospheric conditions, using brief clearings in the visual disturbance to locate and verify the impact point. When confirmation finally came, it was delivered with obvious disbelief from experienced range personnel who understood the difficulty of what they had witnessed. "Center mass confirmed," Morrison announced, his voice carrying amazement that he could no longer conceal despite his professional training. Colonel Harrison reviewed the updated score sheet and looked at the old man, who was already beginning preparation for his second attempt at the extreme distance. 22 consecutive hits, Harrison said to his staff officers, "at distances that exceed the capabilities of our advanced sniper systems. This is redefining what we understand about marksmanship." The old man's second shot at 3,500 meters required another extensive preparation period, during which environmental conditions continued to fluctuate in ways that complicated an already nearly impossible shot. Atmospheric pressure was changing, wind patterns were shifting, and temperature differentials were creating visual distortions that challenged even experienced spotters. Jensen was calculating the mathematical precision required for consistent hits at 3,500 meters, trying to quantify the remarkable performance they were witnessing. The margin for error at this distance is measured in fractions of angular minutes. Wind reading must be perfect within tenths of miles per hour. Scope adjustment must be precise to fractions of clicks. The second shot produced another confirmed hit, adding to a score sheet that was challenging everything the assembled military personnel thought they understood about the limits of rifle marksmanship. Morrison updated his records while preparing for distances that would push beyond any previous military experience. Thompson was explaining the unprecedented nature of the demonstration to senior officers who were struggling to accept what they were observing. "This performance exceeds anything in military records, sir. We're witnessing shooting capability that redefines what's possible with small arms systems." The old man's third shot at 3,500 meters completed another perfect sequence, maintaining consistency that appeared to violate physical laws governing projectile accuracy at extreme distances. The hit was confirmed by multiple independent spotters, and Morrison added it to a score sheet that now showed 24 consecutive hits. Captain Rodriguez was coordinating with range personnel to prepare for the final distance, 3,800 meters, a range that existed at the absolute limits of what could be considered rifle shooting. This was the distance that would either confirm the old man's extraordinary ability or finally reveal the boundaries that physics imposed on marksmanship. Colonel Harrison was reviewing military shooting records, searching for any precedent that might explain what they were witnessing. 3,800 meters is beyond anything in our training protocols, Harrison said to his assembled staff. "We're about to witness an attempt at a distance that challenges the fundamental assumptions of military marksmanship." The announcement for the final target distance brought complete silence among all assembled personnel, military and civilian alike, as they prepared to witness either the culmination of an extraordinary demonstration or the inevitable failure that everyone still expected to see. The 3,800-meter target existed at the absolute frontier of rifle capability, a distance where success depended more on atmospheric fortune than shooting skill. At this range, projectile drop exceeded 200 feet, flight time approached 6 seconds, and environmental variables could overwhelm even perfect technique. This was the shot that would either validate everything they had witnessed or finally reveal the limits that physics imposed on marksmanship. General Patterson had arrived from Regional Command, accompanied by a full-staff contingent that included ballistics experts and senior training personnel. The demonstration had attracted attention from the highest levels of military leadership, transforming what had begun as routine range training into an event of unprecedented significance. 24 consecutive hits at distances up to 3,500 meters, General Patterson said, reviewing the comprehensive score sheet that documented the morning's extraordinary performance. "Using equipment that predates our current military systems by decades. Captain Rodriguez, I need detailed documentation of everything we've observed." The old man was beginning what would be his most extensive preparation routine of the day, a process that required over an hour of environmental assessment and ballistic calculations. His notebook had become a masterwork of atmospheric data, wind measurements taken at multiple locations, temperature readings, barometric pressure observations, and mathematical calculations that accounted for variables most military personnel never considered. Morrison was coordinating with the largest spotting team ever assembled for range operations, positioning observers with the most advanced optical equipment available throughout the facility. Confirming hits at 3,800 meters would challenge every aspect of range safety and observation protocols, requiring unprecedented cooperation between multiple spotting stations. Colonel Harrison was briefing General Patterson on the technical challenges involved in the final shot attempt. "At 3,800 meters, sir, we're beyond the effective envelope of any standard military rifle system. Projectile energy at impact is minimal, environmental effects are extreme, and target acquisition requires atmospheric conditions that rarely occur naturally. The assembled crowd now included over 200 military personnel from throughout the base, representing every specialty and rank structure. Word had spread through official and unofficial channels that something extraordinary was taking place, drawing observers who understood they might be witnessing a redefinition of what was possible in military marksmanship. Staff Sergeant Collins was explaining the mathematical precision required for success at 3,800 meters, trying to help senior officers understand the unprecedented nature of what they were observing. The margin for error at this distance is measured in fractions of angular seconds. A wind reading error of half a mile per hour can cause a miss of several yards. Temperature miscalculation of 1 degree can affect trajectory by feet. The old man's preparation routine included continuous monitoring of atmospheric conditions using equipment he had produced from his worn kit bag. Portable wind meters, temperature sensors, and barometric pressure gauges that appeared to be military surplus from an earlier era, but were clearly maintained in perfect working condition. Major Williams was coordinating with meteorological personnel to provide official atmospheric data for comparison with the old man's independent measurements. His environmental assessment appears to be more comprehensive than our standard range procedures, Williams reported to General Patterson. He's accounting for variables that our protocols don't typically address. The old man was making final adjustments to his rifle scope, a process that required extensive consultation with his notebook and careful observation of atmospheric conditions that continued to change subtly but significantly. His methodical approach suggested understanding of factors that most shooters learned only through decades of experience with extreme distance shooting. Specialist Martinez was studying the ballistic requirements for consistent accuracy at 3,800 meters, calculating the precision demanded for the performance they were about to witness. Every aspect of the shot must be perfect. Rifle camp must be zero. Scope tracking must be exact. Ammunition consistency must be flawless. Environmental reading must be precise within impossible tolerances. The crowd had grown silent as the significance of the moment became clear to everyone present. This was not just another competition shot, but an attempt at a distance that existed at the absolute limits of what rifle marksmanship could achieve. Success would redefine military understanding of shooting capability, while failure would finally restore the natural order that the day's events had challenged. Jensen was reviewing military marksmanship records, searching for any documented attempts at comparable distances under similar conditions. There's no precedent for this in military archives, Jensen reported to his assembled teammates. We're witnessing an attempt at something that's never been officially documented by any military organization. The old man settled into his final shooting position, adjusting his stance to account for the extended time he would need to remain motionless while making final calculations and atmospheric observations. His movements were deliberate and economical, suggesting preparation for a shot that would test every aspect of his shooting ability. Morrison was conducting final equipment checks with his expanded spotting team, ensuring that all observation equipment was functioning properly and positioned optimally for tracking projectile impact at the extreme distance. The visual challenges created by 3,800 meters would make accurate spotting nearly impossible even under perfect conditions. General Patterson was reviewing the documentation requirements for what they were about to witness, knowing that success at this distance would require official verification that met the highest military standards. If this shot succeeds, it will require complete documentation and independent verification. We're potentially witnessing a redefinition of small arms capability. Thompson was explaining the historical significance to newly arrived personnel who were struggling to understand why senior command was devoting such attention to a single rifle shot. This isn't just about marksmanship anymore. This is about understanding the limits of what's possible with military equipment and training. The old man completed his preparation routine and raised his hand to signal readiness for the final shot, a gesture that brought complete silence to the assembled crowd of military personnel who understood they were about to witness either the culmination of an extraordinary demonstration or the inevitable failure that physics seemed to demand. The moment of absolute silence stretched across the range as the old man settled behind his rifle for the 3,800-meter shot that would either validate everything they had witnessed or finally reveal the limits that everyone still expected to find. 200 military personnel held their breath while he made final microscopic adjustments to his scope, movements so small they were barely visible but critical at the extreme distance he was attempting. General Patterson positioned himself at the primary observation station, flanked by ballistics experts and senior range personnel who understood they were about to witness either a redefinition of rifle capability or the inevitable failure that physics seemed to demand. The tension was palpable as decades of military experience suggested that success at this distance was simply impossible with the equipment being used. Morrison coordinated with spotters positioned at 6 different locations, each equipped with the most powerful optical systems available on the base. At 3,800 meters, confirming impact would require immediate attention from multiple observers, careful coordination between spotting teams, and atmospheric conditions that rarely occurred naturally during desert afternoons. The old man's breathing pattern became visible to nearby observers as he entered the final phase of shot preparation. His chest rose and fell with the controlled rhythm that characterized precision shooters, each breath calculated to minimize movement while maintaining the oxygen levels necessary for steady muscle control during the extended aiming process. Wind holding steady at 4 miles per hour from the northeast called out the meteorological specialist who had been monitoring atmospheric conditions. Temperature stable at 98 degrees. Barometric pressure reading 29.72 inches. The old man made one final scope adjustment, a movement so slight that only the closest observers could detect it. His notebook lay open beside him, filled with calculations that accounted for projectile drop of over 200 feet, wind drift that could measure in yards, and atmospheric effects that most shooters never encountered in normal military training. Colonel Harrison was coordinating radio communications with division headquarters, where senior command personnel were monitoring reports of the unprecedented demonstration. The implications of success at 3,800 meters would extend far beyond the training facility, potentially affecting military doctrine regarding the limits of small arms effectiveness. The old man's finger moved to the trigger with deliberate precision, applying pressure so gradually that the moment of firing would come as a surprise even to himself. This was the technique taught to precision marksmen for maintaining accuracy under stress, allowing the subconscious mind to complete the shot while the conscious mind focused on sight alignment and environmental compensation. Staff Sergeant Collins was tracking time through his stopwatch, noting that the final preparation phase had consumed over 20 minutes of careful observation and minute adjustments. The methodical approach demonstrated patience that most military shooters never developed, reflecting experience with shooting conditions that demanded absolute precision. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the desert range, followed immediately by the coordinated movement of spotters to their optical equipment as they began the challenging task of tracking a projectile traveling toward a target nearly 2.5 miles away. The flight time would exceed 5 seconds, long enough for atmospheric conditions to change during the bullet's journey. Morrison focused his spotting scope on the target area, immediately beginning the systematic search pattern that would locate impact signs despite visual distortions created by extreme distance and desert heat. The task required exceptional skill even under optimal conditions, and the afternoon atmospheric effects made accurate observation nearly impossible. Flight time, approximately 5.8 seconds, announced the ballistics specialist who was tracking projectile performance. Projectile energy at impact estimated at less than 400 foot-pounds. Environmental conditions variable during flight. The spotting team worked in coordinated silence, each observer scanning assigned sectors of the target area while maintaining radio communication to prevent duplication of effort. At 3,800 meters, Impact signs could be subtle enough that even experienced spotters might miss them without careful systematic observation. Specialist Harris was scanning the target area through high magnification optics, struggling with atmospheric distortions that made precise observation extremely challenging. I'm seeing possible impact indicators, but atmospheric conditions are making confirmation difficult. I need additional time for verification. The silence stretched as multiple spotters continued their systematic search, understanding that accurate confirmation would require careful observation and multiple independent verifications. The extreme distance made even basic target identification challenging, and locating specific impact points demanded exceptional skill and optimal equipment. Major Williams was monitoring radio communications from the spotting teams, coordinating their efforts to ensure comprehensive coverage of the target area despite the visual challenges created by distance and atmospheric effects. The confirmation process was taking longer than any previous shot of the day, reflecting the unprecedented difficulty of the observation task. Jensen was calculating the ballistic performance required for success at 3,800 meters, trying to quantify the precision that would be necessary for the shot they hoped to confirm. If this is a hit, it represents shooting accuracy that exceeds established military records by significant margins. We're potentially witnessing performance that redefines small arms capability. The spotting team continued their methodical search as atmospheric conditions fluctuated, creating brief windows of improved visibility that allowed more accurate observation of the distant target area. Each spotter maintained focus on assigned sectors while communicating observations that might help colleagues locate impact signs. General Patterson was reviewing the technical specifications for the equipment being used, trying to understand how apparently outdated gear could achieve performance that challenged the most advanced military systems. The ballistic requirements for success at this distance should exceed the capabilities of that rifle system by substantial margins. Thompson was explaining the unprecedented nature of the shot attempt to senior personnel who were struggling to comprehend the technical challenges involved. At 3,800 meters, we're attempting something that exists at the absolute limits of rifle accuracy. Success would represent achievement that has never been officially documented by any military organization. The old man remained motionless behind his rifle, maintaining his shooting position while spotters conducted their systematic search of the target area. His patience reflected understanding that confirmation at extreme distances required time and careful observation, even when atmospheric conditions were challenging accurate spotting. Morrison was coordinating between multiple spotting stations, ensuring that all observers maintained systematic search patterns while avoiding duplication of effort. The confirmation process was approaching 10 minutes, longer than any previous shot of the day, but the extreme distance justified the extended observation period. The atmospheric distortion cleared for just a moment, providing the brief window of visibility that Specialist Harris needed to complete his observation. Through his high-magnification spotting scope, the target area became momentarily sharp enough to reveal what everyone had been searching for during the extended confirmation period. "Contact," Harris called out, his voice cutting through the silence that had stretched across the range. "I have impact confirmation." Morrison immediately shifted his own spotting scope to Harris's sector, working to verify the observation independently before making any official announcement. The extreme distance made even basic confirmation challenging, and the credibility of the entire demonstration depended on accurate reporting that could withstand scrutiny from the senior command personnel who were monitoring every aspect of the proceedings. "I need secondary confirmation before I can make an official call," Morrison announced, his voice carrying the professional caution that characterized experienced range safety personnel when dealing with shots that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. Major Williams moved to the backup spotting station, focusing his optical equipment on the coordinates that Harris had provided. The verification process required careful, systematic observation through equipment that represented the finest optical technology available to the military, operated by personnel whose experience qualified them to make authoritative assessments. The silence was broken only by the quiet radio communications between spotting stations as multiple observers worked to confirm what Harris had reported. General Patterson watched the verification process with growing tension, understanding that the implications of this single shot extended far beyond the training facility where it was taking place. Secondary confirmation achieved, Williams announced after several minutes of careful observation. Impact visible in center mass area of target. Shot appears to be a direct hit. The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical force, creating a moment of stunned silence as 200 military personnel struggled to process what they had just heard. 25 consecutive hits at distances ranging from 800 to 3,800 meters represent a performance that challenged everything they understood about the limits of rifle marksmanship. Morrison made the official announcement with obvious reluctance, his voice carrying disbelief despite the multiple confirmations he had received from qualified spotters. Official confirmation of center mass hit at 3,800 meters. Target impact verified by multiple independent observers. Colonel Harrison stepped back from his observation position, shaking his head slowly as he tried to reconcile what he had witnessed with decades of military experience that suggested such performance was impossible. This violates everything we understand about the effective range of small arms systems. The old man slowly rose from his shooting position, methodically beginning the process of securing his rifle and equipment with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his entire demonstration. His movements were unhurried and deliberate, suggesting that the extraordinary shot he had just completed was simply the natural conclusion to a morning's work. General Patterson approached the firing line, his expression reflecting the mixture of amazement and professional concern that characterized senior officers when confronted with developments that challenged established military doctrine. "Sir, I need to understand exactly what we've witnessed here today." The old man looked up from his equipment, his weathered face showing no sign of satisfaction or surprise at what he had accomplished. When he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet tone that had characterized his few words throughout the morning. "Just applying what I learned during my service, General." Staff Sergeant Collins was reviewing the completed score sheet, documenting performance that exceeded anything in military records. 25 consecutive hits at progressive distances represented accuracy that redefined understanding of what was achievable with rifle marksmanship, regardless of equipment quality or shooter experience. Jensen was calculating the statistical probability of the performance they had witnessed, trying to quantify what had just occurred in terms that could be understood by personnel who were struggling to accept the evidence of their own observations. The probability of 25 consecutive hits at these distances is so low that it's essentially impossible by conventional understanding. The assembled Rangers and military personnel were beginning to realize that their initial dismissal of the old man had been completely wrong, based on assumptions about age and capability that had been systematically dismantled by his extraordinary demonstration. The casual entertainment they had expected had become a lesson in the dangers of judging capability by appearance. Thompson was explaining to senior officers that the demonstration represented more than exceptional marksmanship. This performance suggests understanding of ballistics and environmental factors that exceeds what most military personnel achieve, even with computer assistance and modern equipment. Morrison was coordinating with range personnel to begin the formal documentation process that would be required for official verification of the records that had been established. The unprecedented nature of the performance would demand comprehensive reporting that met the highest military standards for accuracy and credibility. Major Williams was reviewing the technical aspects of what they had witnessed, trying to understand how equipment that appeared to be decades old had achieved performance that challenged modern military hardware. The ballistic precision required for this demonstration should exceed the mechanical capabilities of that rifle system. The old man finished securing his equipment and closed his worn rifle case with the same careful attention he had shown throughout the morning. His preparation to leave suggested that he considered the demonstration complete, regardless of the impact it had created among the assembled military personnel. Corporal Davies approached the old man with obvious respect, his earlier amusement completely replaced by professional admiration for what he had witnessed. "Sir, that was the most extraordinary shooting demonstration I've ever seen. Would you mind if I asked about your military background?" The old man looked at Davies with eyes that reflected decades of experience with situations that most people never encountered. "Special operations," he said quietly. "Vietnam through Afghanistan. 43 years of service before retirement." General Patterson was coordinating with his staff to begin the comprehensive review process that would be required to understand the implications of what they had witnessed. The demonstration had challenged fundamental assumptions about military capability and would require extensive analysis by ballistics experts and training specialists. Colonel Harrison was reviewing military personnel records, trying to locate information about the old man whose performance had redefined their understanding of what was possible with small arms marksmanship. "I want complete documentation of this demonstration and a full technical analysis of the equipment and methods involved." The crowd of military personnel was beginning to disperse, but many remained to observe the old man's departure, understanding that they had witnessed something that would be discussed and analyzed for years to come. The casual dismissal that had characterized the morning's beginning had been replaced by profound respect for capability that transcended age and equipment limitations. The old man walked slowly toward the facility exit, carrying his worn rifle case with the same deliberate care he had shown throughout the morning. Behind him, 200 military personnel remained in various states of amazement, their assumptions about age and capability permanently altered by what they had witnessed on the precision range. General Patterson was coordinating with his staff to ensure comprehensive documentation of the demonstration, understanding that the performance they had observed would require extensive analysis and official verification. "I want complete ballistic analysis of every shot, environmental data for all firing conditions, and technical evaluation of the equipment used." Morrison was compiling the final score sheet that documented 25 consecutive hits at distances ranging from 800 to 3,800 meters, performance that represented the most extraordinary marksmanship demonstration in the facility's history. The mathematical precision required for such consistency challenged conventional understanding of what was humanly possible. Staff Sergeant Collins approached the old man before he could reach the exit, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by professional respect. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, how did you develop that level of precision?" "I've been teaching marksmanship for 15 years, and I've never seen anything comparable." The old man paused and looked at Collins with eyes that reflected decades of experience with challenging shooting conditions. "Practice," he said simply. "Lots of practice under conditions where missing wasn't an option. Vietnam taught me that equipment doesn't matter as much as understanding what you're working with." Colonel Harrison was reviewing the technical implications of what they had witnessed, trying to understand how the demonstration would affect military training protocols and equipment standards. "This performance suggests that we may be underestimating the potential of properly trained personnel using well-maintained equipment, regardless of its age." The assembled Rangers were discussing the lessons learned from the morning's events, acknowledging that their initial dismissal of the old man had been based on superficial judgments rather than careful assessment of capability. The experience had challenged their assumptions about the relationship between age, equipment, and performance in ways that would influence their future evaluations. Jensen was explaining to his teammates that the demonstration represented more than exceptional shooting skill. What we witnessed was the application of decades of experience with environmental factors that most of us never encounter. He wasn't just shooting accurately, he was reading conditions that we don't even know exist. Major Williams was coordinating with meteorological personnel to compile comprehensive atmospheric data for the entire morning, understanding that the environmental conditions during the demonstration would be critical for analyzing and replicating the performance they had observed. The old man reached the facility gate and paused to look back at the range where he had spent the morning systematically dismantling every assumption about his capabilities. His expression showed no satisfaction or pride, simply the quiet professionalism of someone who had completed a task to the best of his ability. Specialist Martinez approached with obvious respect, carrying questions that reflected the curiosity of younger personnel who were struggling to understand what they had witnessed. Sir, would you be willing to share any advice for those of us who are trying to improve our long-range shooting capabilities? The old man considered the question carefully before responding. Understand your equipment completely. Learn to read environmental conditions accurately. Practice under the worst conditions you can find. And remember that consistency matters more than individual exceptional shots. Thompson was documenting the technical aspects of the demonstration for training purposes, noting that the methodical approach used by the old man represented a systematic understanding of ballistics that could benefit military marksmanship programs. His preparation routine alone could be developed into advanced training protocols. General Patterson was reviewing the broader implications of what they had witnessed, understanding that the demonstration challenged military assumptions about personnel capability and equipment effectiveness. This performance suggests that experience and proper training may be more important factors than we've traditionally recognized. The old man adjusted his grip on his rifle case and prepared to leave the facility, his departure marking the end of a demonstration that had redefined the understanding of marksmanship capability for everyone who had witnessed it. His quiet demeanor suggested that extraordinary performance was simply the natural result of proper preparation and extensive experience. Davies approached with his smartphone, hoping to capture some record of the historic demonstration. Sir, would you mind if I took a photo? I think people need to know what happened here today. The old man shook his head politely. I prefer to let the work speak for itself, he said quietly. Besides, most people wouldn't believe it anyway. Morrison was coordinating with range personnel to begin the comprehensive analysis that would be required to understand the technical aspects of the demonstration. The ballistic calculations alone would require extensive computer modeling to verify the precision that had been achieved under the environmental conditions present during the shooting. Staff Sergeant Collins was reviewing training protocols, considering how the methodical approach demonstrated by the old man could be incorporated into military marksmanship instruction. We've been focusing on equipment and technology when we should have been emphasizing environmental assessment and systematic preparation. The old man walked through the facility gate for the final time, carrying with him the quiet satisfaction of having demonstrated that capability couldn't be judged by appearance or equipment age. Behind him, the military personnel he was leaving had learned lessons about assumption and assessment that would influence their careers for years to come. As his figure disappeared into the desert heat, the assembled rangers and officers began the process of understanding what they had witnessed and how it would change their approach to marksmanship training and personnel evaluation. The morning had begun with casual dismissal, but had ended with profound respect for the power of experience and the danger of superficial judgment. How do you think this story connects to situations in your own life where people might be underestimated based on first impressions? Sometimes the quiet ones have the most to teach us. Captain Rodriguez was already planning the comprehensive report that would document the day's events for senior command, knowing that the demonstration would be analyzed and discussed throughout the military for years to come. The old man had arrived as a curiosity and departed as a legend, leaving behind a legacy that would redefine understanding of what was possible when experience met opportunity.